Businesses are closing, high unemployment within the Black population, more so than other individuals. And we seem to be targeted a great deal with these never-ending list of videos, viral videos, that are showing Black people being mistreated, attacked, and killed, particularly by police officers. So with all of this going on, with this new normal that we are currently in, I want to start by asking Dr. Span, how are you doing, brother?
Well, thank you for asking me that. Anytime I get that question, I appreciate it. Particularly being a therapist, it's something that I think people think because you're a therapist, you got it going on. And that's not the truth. And particularly being in my body as a Black male, I'm experiencing everything from the social political issues down to just what's going on in my own family and then what I'm experiencing. But overall, I would say my mental wellness is not doing too bad. And I'm gauging that day to day. But I can say that at least for today, my mental wellness is actually at a good place. And I'm actually happy about that.
I'm glad to hear that too. Dr. Akinyela, how are you? How are you holding up in today's times with this new normal?
Yes, sir. I'm actually doing fine today. As my brother Dr. Span says, this is a good day, actually. I came in, got a good start off, got some yoga in this morning before we got started, right? So the bones are working right. So today I'm good.
I'm glad you're doing well. So as we're talking about this new normal, and the three of us are doing fairly well. I can do without the COVID-19, to be honest with you, and all of the uncertainty that comes with it. As my routine has been thrown off, I feel a little bit out of balance, to be honest with you. Trying to plan school for my daughter and for my own university that may start face-to-face, or we might do online school. But with all of these things going on, we're handling things fairly well. How do you believe other Black men are handling this current new normal that we're going through? What are you guys seeing within your practices with the Black male clients that you see?
I'm seeing a range, and it's. I think we had a conversation yesterday, and I mentioned that I'm getting more calls recently from young men from early 20s, late teens, up to late 30s who are calling in for individual therapy. That's and that I specialize in working with couples, but I'm getting these individual men who are calling who just want to talk. They want somebody to talk to. They want, and oftentimes those conversations are about just what's going on. The anxiety that's created from the fear of just walking down the street or whatever it might be. And that's a new thing, getting those kinds of calls, getting so many short period of time to the point that it's noticing. So it's telling me that men themselves as men are feeling some pressure and are looking for some outlets, some relief to deal.
Gotcha. So I'm actually glad to hear you're seeing an increase in the number of brothers who are reaching out, who actually want to talk about something. Dr. Span, what are you seeing within your practice? Like what are the trends with the Black men more recently this year, 2020, that you're seeing with your Black male clients?
That's a good question. I'm seeing more of a call to action. And so the call to action, particularly for the younger brothers, is, as mentioning before, is that they're going out in places of protest or demonstrating through social justice, that they're finding some strength in that. I think for the older gentlemen that are coming into the practice, I find that there's this level of navigating through their own career and dealing with what is the norm or what's actually happening within their from top down or being a CEO. And so I think there's just these variances on one, if you're out there in the community, you're talking about what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. And for some of the older gentlemen, talking about what is it to be in their career, what they're looking for their colleagues, having to confront or talk about, to white colleagues or other colleagues about what they're experiencing and the frustration that comes along with that. But ultimately, what I'm finding is that it runs the gambit on where some feel a level of hopelessness, some feel a level of needing to engage, and then some needing to feel like they need to do a counter narrative to what people feel about how Black men are showing up during these times.
Absolutely. It's a number of issues that we have to face. So I'm seeing with my clients, the Black men have come in over the last month or so, month and a half or so. They're already battling. These are current existing clients. So they're already battling some issues that they're trying to confront. Now they are a little bit distracted by this new issue, and they have heightened anxiousness that they're feeling, and some anger as well. And it sort of feels like that original issue that brought them in has taken a back seat, because now they're focused on, how do I operate in this society? What do I do? Are you noticing that a number of your Black male clients are overwhelmed by the current circumstances that we're dealing with? Dr. Akinyela?
Yeah.
You're mute.
Sorry. I was thinking as Dr. Span was talking, in particular, my young guys who are in the streets, who are active. I've got one who is actually totally traumatized because they were actually leading demonstrations and getting caught in crossfire in a gun battle.
Oh, wow.
And which had never happened to them before, even though they've been doing activist work for a few years, university student, which, I mean, really traumatized that person. And they're just now recovering from that. They actually were hospitalized for a couple of weeks as a result of that. So in that sense, I've got a young man who's a bit older, who was called because they were upset. They went into a staff meeting. They're like the only Black person in the staff meeting. And it was decided that everyone had to kind of pick up and do some work. And he was assigned to clean up the bathroom. And in the midst of all this, he says, "No, I'm not doing that." Right? For him, that had some real significance. And it brought down for him all the stress of dealing with what he saw as aggressions, microaggressions coming in the job, being an only Black on the job. And, there's things like that that go on.
Yeah, I find it interesting. The first client that you talked about, he's out there protesting against injustices, police brutality, and now he has to also deal with some situations within the protesting community and possibly his own community where he lives, and he cannot find any way to escape, some of this violence and things that are going on. So Dr. Span, are you noticing that your Black male clients are much more overwhelmed than they have been in the past?
Yeah, and particularly talking about after the George Floyd incident, I think for many of my Black men, what happened was this very heavy weightedness. And so there was an experience of migraines or headaches and or needing to sleep for a very long time and a level of disbelief. And so if we think about the psychosomatic and just thinking this, that was a lot of the same narrative, particularly at my practice, I see many Black men and knowing that one said the same thing and then another and another and another. So there seemed to be this trend going on. And it wasn't uncommon to a trend that I heard after many other killings and shootings of Black individuals. And so I can tell you that there's a psychosomatic experience that was happening, and then the social political and feeling like, what can I do to push back? And what does that mean for the protection of myself, protection of my family? And how do I change either laws or policies, or how do I show up differently in spaces that I normally were in?
Gotcha. Thank you so much. I can also remember a moment where I felt overwhelmed, and this is connected to what you were talking about. It was about a week or so after the George Floyd killing. The videos all over the internet, and so I'm talking to everybody about it. Every conversation was about that topic, and when I went into a Zoom meeting with some colleagues who are all white, and they seem to live in a different world. You know, the topic never came up. They were laughing, they were joking, they were telling us about their weekend and what they cooked and what they did with their friends. And I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, they are not having the same experience as I. And I remember I had to monitor my own reaction to them enjoying the day, because they have the ability to turn off the internet. They can turn the channel. You know, they can believe an alternative there. So are you guys also noticing some of your clients are just trying to navigate how to respond to other people who may have varied opinions about what's going on, or they're simply clueless about what's going on? Dr. Span, let's start with you.
You know, what I find is that one, that sense of like being clueless, naive, or being maybe arrested and not knowing what to do. But when that happens, it's like a microaggression. It's almost like saying you don't kind of navigate that, or you don't know how to approach that. Then you're just going to either avoid that kind of conversation or not have it, as Dr. Akinyela was talking about, the point where you feel invisible by that happening. And, you know, I recently started reading the book again by Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. And the book speaks so much to me right now, because when you don't know how to deal with something, from a therapist down to, you know, maybe a coworker, this invisibility starts to happen, or you feel that sense of like, I'm not being seen, I'm not being, and so it's not a silent protest, and it's not being a part of the protest. It's wanting to be acknowledged and heard. And I think that's what we're really trying to get. And avoiding the subjects or not being, don't preclude you from this issue.
Gotcha. Dr. A, what do you have to say about that?
As you were talking, I thought about, you know, that sense of being isolated in this notion, whether you're a client or a therapist. You talk about your experience of that call, you know, and I was just thinking about, I'm a part of this group of therapists, and I'm assuming that most of them are white and there's this ongoing debate about the virus, about the pandemic, and they're arguing the science of the pandemic, and there tends to be a preponderance of arguments that maybe it's, you know, I think they're just overstating the fact, right? And it's in scientific language, thinking, I don't know a Black person who doesn't know a Black person who has died from this virus, gotten seriously sick from this virus, right? In the last 30 days, I know at least 5 people who have died, right? And so that's the common experience in the Black community. And so to hear all this, the virus is significant or real. This even goes into conversation. I think you mentioned it. My university is still insisting that professors have to be in there with their students, right? And so Black faculty is actually significant for us, right? This has a much greater impact. And again, if you're in isolation of, well, are we the only ones who are experiencing this as serious? And if nobody else is, maybe it's not that serious, right? That's that kind of cognitive dissonance that happens when you live Black in the world.
Absolutely. I experienced it. And I wasn't quite sure how to handle it, because I didn't want to cause a scene. You know, I didn't want to make it seem like I was having an issue because everybody else is laughing, you know. And I just saw a video 4 days ago of a cop killing a Black man, and all of my friends, family members, and colleagues are all talking about it. And we're trying to figure out what to do. So these are some of the things that we have to deal with within the Black community. And sometimes Black men handle things a little bit differently. And the things that I mentioned earlier about the pandemic, joblessness, killing people, being mistreated by other individuals. So I want to ask the question, are Black men in the middle of a mental health crisis? That's the question that I want to, or have we always been in crisis? And is it simply coming out now in various ways? Dr. A, let's start with you.
I think we've always been in a crisis. I mean, that's the reality. The difference is now the crisis is on television. And so, you know, now actually, when you're in the crisis, sometimes you don't notice it. But now when it's on television, you're actually, it's that strange feeling of being outside of yourself, looking back in on yourself. So now you can see it. right? So there's this crisis. So now it even feels worse
Yeah.
that we're in. And I think that the mental health part of it is, the good news is, I think that our people are much more aware of the reality of mental health, right? And so they acknowledge it as a mental health crisis, right? They acknowledge that, hey, if I'm struggling with something, I should get help, and hey, maybe I can get help. And so people are responding in that way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Dr. Span, what do you have to say? Are Black men in the middle of a mental health crisis?
No, I don't believe that Black men are in the middle of a mental health crisis. I think where we're at now is at a place where we're in the middle of trying to fit and get into a place of dealing more with the wellness and looking at it from that strength-based approach. And what I mean by that is that I acknowledge with this that it's always been going on, and it's going on before 1619. You know, if we think about the issues of the Black diaspora and anti-Blackness and what we've been, and the strength of being a Black man, and particularly in my own body, and thinking about the community and the culture, there's always been this level of having to have that strength, but actually trying to balance that, and then also understand vulnerability and the fragility of that. And so, you know, what has been encapsulated or insulated by experiences that we've had, realizing as a community, finding other protective factors outside of just some of the spirituality that we've been leaning on. How do we lean on some of the factors that we have in helping our wellness and mental wellness? And with that, there's a lot of shifting happening with therapists and therapists of color particularly, and also finding that in conversations from barbershops and other places that we are shifting that conversation. I think that's where we're in the middle of. How do we continue to shift that conversation for better?
I like
sense of
that. I'm
wellness?
glad we're talking about mental health. I'm glad that we're actually recognizing that something is wrong. But what I have noticed is that there has been an increase in that particular conversation, or people are talking about it more since the George Floyd video. In particular, that's when I noticed a great deal of Black people not only talking about racial injustice and brutality and bigotry, but they're talking about, oh, my life can be in danger simply because of my Blackness. Did that incident trigger or expand issues that we are currently experiencing, Dr. Span?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I feel out of protest from the killing of George Floyd, from the many deaths that have happened this year and the many deaths that have happened prior to this year. It's all come. It's people are tired, and particularly Black people are tired, and we've gone out into the streets and demonstrated in many ways to show that. And then there's been this firestorm that's gone across the world, and it's also been a fire that's been lit in many people where maybe it's been dim or not at all, and awakening and saying the only way that we're going to be able to push forward, and this is something that Dr. Barbara Sizemore says, is that we have to be healthy within ourselves. We have to be healthy within our communities. And I think people are realizing that dealing with our wellness, particularly in the Black community, means that we have to examine some places that we haven't been examining, and it's been at rest. And I think that has picked up a sense of protest within oneself, and in social justice within oneself, coming around mental health, education, criminal justice reform. And I think now we're seeing people are now collectively coming together to also address that as well.
Gotcha. So there are many of us who believe our Blackness has been villainized. And what do you believe is the impact of when Black men discover or realize that we are suspicious, you know, simply because of our ethnicity, simply because of our Blackness? You know, what is the
That's a good question. I'm going to come about it in a
I can
couple
come
of
back.
ways.
I can come back to
No. I'm just as you're talking. I think that we've always known that we're suspicious in our Blackness. We've always known that our Blackness threat to white people. Again, the difference is we see the evidence so much, and it's like historically we've known it, and they're just kind of just nagging. Well, maybe, right? and there's always a sense of maybe I'm crazy because I think that. And we've also been told that we were being paranoid, right? You're being paranoid if you think that somebody's racist. You're being paranoid that somebody clutched their purse a little tighter when you walked into the elevator. So we had this sense of, I feel like this, but maybe I don't. There's this, but again, we've got this perfect storm now of social media and these occurrences. And so we see people actually voicing and saying these things that happen. And now there's no doubt to us that our paranoia was legitimate, right? Just
Gotcha.
because you're paranoid does not mean nobody's watching you.
Gotcha. And
So we've
I
been
must,
confirmed in that.
yeah, and I must admit, maybe with the older generation, that may be an issue that is experienced a great deal. But I have met a number of young brothers, let's say under 30 years old. They were clueless about all of this. I'm not quite sure if these conversations were taking place within their families. They were not aware of it. They were not prepared, for all of these realities. So, Dr. Span, I believe you're the youngest of the group here. what do you believe is the impact of those young brothers realizing that simply being Black makes them a target? As someone else finds them suspicious just because they are who they are. What's the impact of that?
Well, the impact of that is, as we say the phrase, stay woke. Once you have this, awareness, right? And, if we talk about cross-model of nigrescence, there's this moment where you're like, you know what, maybe it ain't all good. Maybe the way that I am walking around where people do look at me, it's not me just being paranoid. There's been some confirmation in that. You're disenfranchised and thinking, like, well, I see it all the time. And it's definitely a micro insult. And what can I do about it? But I'm always thinking about levels of empowerment. And, when we saw that video, we saw that clip about, walking the dog in the park and the lady, like, feeling like she was empowered to call, but then also feeling empowered that, hey, no, I have my rights as well. And I think that's what level of knowing, what are your rights? Where are you empowered at? And saying, like, sometimes somebody may just be walking by and then you have to think through how that made you feel and still knowing your value. Because your value is still within you, although that's how that person wants to react to you. You are still valued as a Black man. You are still doing the right thing. And I think that's the affirmation, but also knowing what are your rights? If somebody is trying to take your rights away, staying safe, being healthy and all that, but knowing that you have rights as a man and as a human being and as an American citizen as well.
Absolutely. And I appreciated how that brother handled that situation with the woman in the New York City park, with the dog. He stood his ground. He remained confident. He remained assertive. And he handled that quite well when he pulled out his phone to videotape the incident. I think that was a critical move by him. Not quite sure of his age, but I think I think it's fair to say he's over 35 by the way that he was looking. But there are those individuals, they don't know what to do. They're shocked. They're surprised, and it's uneasy for them as they realize, oh, they see me the way they see other individuals, and that goes to these portrayals of Black men and Black people in the media. Do we see ourselves in the media? Accurate portrayals of us in the media, Dr. A? I see you anxious to say something.
I think a part of what you're describing, maybe when young people are surprised by the racism, and I think there's a divide. A lot of the changes that have been brought about by younger people, not even just millennials, but Generation Z, right, who are very much aware of it. But there has also for years now been this popularization of Black culture, right? And I think when you grow up seeing everybody loving your culture, you assume that they're loving you.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody's singing your songs, wearing your clothes, even speaking your language. It feels like, hey, we must be accepted and we must be loved. And I think that's the impact of what I call liberal multiculturalism, right? Thinking just because people like your food that they like you. Right.
Some false assumptions.
Yeah. And I think that becomes the surprise, right? The very same person who loves to sing rap or hip hop songs, right? Who loves to talk in Ebonics, but they still have these racist ideas. I think the young woman you mentioned in Central part, one of her defenses is that she voted for Obama. And right, and so I think that understanding, I think this is a moment when we're starting to really define what racism is, what white supremacy is, right? And understanding that we need to go beyond the conversation about so-called race to conversations about racism, about the ideology of I have a right to be in first place and you don't. And so you need to move back. And that's kind of the disconcerting thing that young people are learning at this moment, that just because they lack our culture does not mean that we're acceptable.
Gotcha. So, Dr. Span, what do you think about these portrayals on media of Black men in particular? We can just stick with that group, of course. And are we seeing ourselves in media? Are we seeing accurate portrayals of us? And how do we respond with all of these negative images and narratives that are out there?
I think there's times where there's accurate portrayals, and then I think there's inaccurate portrayals. And I think Dr. A hit it on the nail on the head by saying like that liberal multiculturalism. And where I feel like we're doing a great job is that we have many writers now and producers in Hollywood or in other spaces, like Issa Rae, for an example, and how she portrays Black people and people of color and Black love in these spaces. And I think those are the kind of moments where I know, because we're getting into circles, we're getting into spaces where we have people that are truth writers and writing our narratives in ways that reflect on how we live and experience life today or historically. And then I also feel like in social media, that's always a land where, there's a little bit of fiction going on, or a lot of fiction going on. And so it's always weird to see how that's portrayed. But I feel like there are many people, particularly therapists, particularly advocates, stepping in spaces and saying, well, this is the narrative, or this is what's going on. And then I feel like there's still this other position and or adjacent narrative that's happening that many African Americans feel like they have to do a counter narrative to, feeling like we still have these pictures and portrayals and roles of us that aren't true. But I feel like there's some variance in that, and so it's culture shifting as well.
Gotcha. I'm glad to hear you mention counter narrative. I hadn't heard that term before. One of the things that I like to do is encourage people to take advantage of social media. Here's our opportunity to present our narrative, in images and videos that we can promote about us. Every time I see one of my Facebook friends, just put a photo of your family, you're out of, I like it. I comment about, encourage other people to do it. Show us a picture of you and your partner, your spouse, going out on a date, because those are the positive images that we have that we can create ourselves, as opposed to relying on media and other outlets who may have some other type of agenda. So I really like that concept of counter narrative, and we do have an opportunity to produce some images that accurately portray us and the real world that we live. So we're going to move on to another topic for today and Black men, and talk specifically about some barriers that are there. And one of the barriers, maybe more internal barriers that we talked about recently, was toxic masculinity. And I want to make sure that we talk about that. And I want us to define it as it relates to Black men. So I'm going to call it Black male masculine toxicity. Dr. Span, can you define that for us? What is Black toxic masculinity?
I think you think about that Black male toxic masculinity. It's something that's been internalized, right? It's a message that either has been sent from society. It's a message that's been sent from family members. It could have been sent from, a message that maybe even you were sending out, right? Like meaning you and your own body as a Black male. But what is that culture? And so when we think about the culture, there's a subculture. It could come from different places in media. It could come in places of hanging around with the homeboys. It could come from what people think Black men are supposed to act, think, and behave. And so when we think about this toxic masculinity, it's having that idea that I need to be a certain persona, or what I think of as a man or a male, or this is how I'm supposed to think and act and feel as a Black man or as a man. And then I internalize some of these social, cultural issues that come along with that, and showing up physically, how I show up mentally, how I show up spiritual, and then all that coming encapsulated in a complex idea of how do I think I can behave with other people in my life? Am I coming overly masculine, hyper masculine, having very set roles in how I think I can behave within my family or with my friends? And then what does that show up as of my mental health and my actions and behavior of either aggression, anxiety, or an identity or a loss of identity, because I cannot totally align what people want me to be and think me to be, and I don't feel that way. My disassociation or juxtaposition of who that is. And so I think all that comes into like toxic
I
masculinity.
see. Sounds like a set of rules for behavior, or how my expectations for me based on my gender and my ethnicity. Dr. A, what do you have to say about that? Help us to expand on this understanding of Black male toxic masculinity.
I, I think it's basically being, first of all, just the basic idea of what it means to be a man, right? And so when we talk about toxic masculinity, it's not an argument against being masculine, right? It's an argument against buying into these ideas where they tend to divorce themselves from all the connecting emotions, divorce themselves from love, from empathy, from sympathy, from compassion, because that's not manly, right? What's
Emotionless.
manly, what's manly is I don't care, I don't give a F, right? I ain't got no love, right? What 50 Cent said, I'm not into making love, I'm into sex, whatever it is, right? It's that idea that that's what real manhood is about. And ultimately, when we put that racial label on it, Black male, that is the idea of manhood that comes from patriarchal thinking. So it's something that's taught to us within this system. And of course, it gets racialized because, hey, if I'm a real Black man, right? So we decided what real look like. And it goes to looking like the ugliest parts of what patriarchy teaches us, right? As opposed to seeing that, hey, manhood can be about being compassionate, right? Manhood can be about having empathy and having a sense of sharing spirit for your partner and with your partner, right? As opposed to a dominating spirit as the defining thing.
Gotcha. So what?
And that's a hard thing, and I think that comes up in a lot of our sessions all the time. Men who are struggling, right? Their relationships are really being embittered by that toxic masculine spirit.
Yep. So, Dr. Span, what are some of the consequences of toxic with Black men? How does that play out? How does that look? How does that cause problems for brothers?
In so many ways. And I think even and I noticed a little bit in the chat box, and just thinking about what does that mean for the development of it, and how a father is raising their child and passing on toxic masculinity. And so we think about that generationally happening, and then continuing that and foster that in the seed, and watching it grow, where we can kind of block that. And what does that mean for the father-son's relationship, or father-son relationship, and in that meaning. Also in relationships, as I think Dr. A also mentioned, just saying like, how do I emote, show up, think, act, and feel with my significant other? Am I acting out what my father or my brothers or my other men I saw in my life doing, and playing a role, or what I think this is what it should be, or thinking this is what she wants, and not really being very intentional about how I want to be or show up, and not getting to the core. But in the end, having to deal with that socially and mentally, it's just a lot on anybody in one's body to have to deal with that. And then when you're left alone, in the sense of having to deal with your own thoughts and own reflection, that could be a very dark place for you, because you realize that it's been an identity that is so closely matched with the mask that you wear that you don't know which one is which.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the whole issue of the relationship between the father and the son. It reminds me of this situation that I saw at a football game years ago. In front of me were two fathers and their sons. One was white and one was Black. And the sons were about 8 or 9 years old. And so during the national anthem, the white father and son, they put their arms around each other and they were singing the national anthem. And then I saw the little Black boy look at that, and he attempted to put his arm around his dad, who of course was black. And guess what his dad did? He shrugged his arm off and he said something to him. Don't put your arm on me. Don't touch me. Dr. Akinyela, what can you imagine the signals, the messages that were sent to that little boy and other black boys out there who have similar experiences with their black fathers about masculinity?
Absolutely. That can be damaging. Even though I have to say, I've children are grown, and I've
Lucky
seen
you.
but I've seen something really. I am so inspired by the young black fathers that I see these days. Even from my own son, who has two small boys, 8 and 12, and other young fathers who I see, even those fathers who come to visit me in my office, right? Using Dr. Span's idea of a counter narrative, there's a serious counter narrative in play right now. And I'm really proud of the young black fathers that I see these days who don't seem to be as caught up in what you just described, which is probably more from my own generation. And I'm seeing that on a regular basis. So I believe that it's a real trend that's happening amongst young black fathers, is a real love for the fatherhood itself, for the connection with their children. So, yeah.
That's wonderful, because I too think it's damaging, as I still remember that image in my head and the look on that little black boy's face, because he couldn't do what the little white boy was doing and he was rejected, by his father, and he wanted to bond and have this moment with his father. And Dr. Span, you talked about the impact on the relationship with sons and fathers. What are other ways toxic masculinity can play out for black men, particularly with their mental health?
Yeah, good question. So I think the other way that it plays out is feeling like as a man, I don't do certain things to maintain my wellness, or to deal with my mental health or my emotional health. And what I would say is whatever's available to other people is available to you. And I think that's where we have to stop telling ourselves no, or saying like, I can't do that because it may be effeminate, or I can't do that because it may make me look less of or emasculate me. My thing is, brother, if that gets you well, which gets you well. And so there's a plethora of things that may, and so not trying to dance down a road of what that is for everybody. But at the same time, particularly when I talk about this with my black men in therapy, if that's a moment of where we're sharing and he's emotional and he's crying and he's letting that out, my thing is, brother, let it out. That's your space to let it out. We need to start having these moments. And so that's what I'm talking about, that social emotional and getting help and thinking about wellness and not thinking that it makes you lesser than, not in dealing with that level of masculinity.
Gotcha. And when it comes to masculinity, you mentioned stigma. So Dr. A, tell us about your understanding about the stigma for black men seeking out mental health care or just seeking out a counselor or therapist. Tell me your understanding about that.
Probably we've been hearing this for a long time. Those of us who have gone to school to be therapists, that there's this stigma about mental health. And yes, there is. And I believe that it's understandable stigma, right? People have a long history of being abused and misused by the health professions, by
absolutely
professions, from the invention of the mental disorder of drapetomania, right? Runaway slave disorder, where it was written in journals that black people who ran away from slavery could only do that if they were mentally disordered, right? Of course, what we know about research plans like what happened in Tuskegee, right, where black men were allowed to have syphilis, even though there was a cure that was available, just so they could see what the track of that was. Or the use of black prisoners for early lobotomy experimentations, right, to see what would happen if you took out the person's frontal lobe. And guess what? Those stories are retold and retold in black communities. That's the barrier we have, right? Because something really was happening and the stories get told. Or the fact that in many counties in the South, there are mental hospitals that started out as what were called colored mental health hospitals, right? In Mississippi, where I grew up, there was Whitfield, right? There's a hospital here and they were used to house formerly enslaved people, giving them a mental health disorder as an excuse to imprison them and re-enslave them. So there's all that history that gets told, right? So the fact that our people are a little leery about medical doctors and psychiatrists, that people don't want you getting into their heads, is understandable. So that's the basis of that stigma. On the other hand, I think what has been happening over the years is, as more people like us, Black professionals, get involved in this professional, and our people know that people are coming from the community, as more people like us are actually having conversations from our community experiences, people are learning, hey, there is some place that I can go, trust.
Gotcha.
They're looking for us.
I know some real fears that Dr. A just talked about that many of us are aware of, or the stories have been shared from our parents or our grandparents, or we can read about it now over the internet. But Dr. Spann, how can we help to overcome some of those negative stigmas about mental health, particularly for Black men?
I think it comes in the messaging, and I think it's about culture shifting, right? Because if we look at the history of mental health, psychiatry, psychologists, we particularly see it's white men, and then it was at some point shifted to white women, and now we're getting into this next wave of where we have more diversity, or the percentage is increasing. It's still low, but for the ones that are showing up in the space, as well as those that are accomplices with us, we're seeing that we're shifting that narrative. We're not using Minority Mental Health Month. We're thinking about BIPOC, right?
Yeah.
And so what we're doing is we're trying to shift the language and shifting the narrative. And that's the messaging, because what we're doing is saying, hey, all Black people, come into therapy and come and get your help. And it's like, well, they know that. They're thinking, is that space for me, right? Do I see myself in that space? And my thing is, are you creating a welcoming space, right? Are you sending messages that it's welcoming?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we'll put it on the showing up or not coming into therapy.
Yeah.
Are you making that space welcoming? Are you saying it's a welcoming space? Are you talking amongst other therapists, but not putting the message out continuously that this space is welcoming to BIPOC? So I think that's what we really have to do. It's culture shifting, not to just saying like, oh, now within us, we see differently and we should charge forward, but how do we also mention and put the message out on come in, and the space looks exactly what we're putting out, and they get that same experience as well.
Absolutely. I like that. I also encourage my students, see the clients for who they are, get rid of any type of bias or stereotype that you might have, and listen to them as they tell their story. We don't need a reference. You don't need to compare it to yourself or to other Black people who you might now their story is a little bit different. So I like that idea of creating a welcome space, particularly for Black men, because it's already challenging, or even to recognize, acknowledge something is wrong, and I gotta talk about it. So I'm glad to hear you guys talk about that. So I want to shift now to something that's really important. And I remember, I think Dr. Spann, you mentioned the television show Insecure. I watched that too on HBO. And there was a couple of episodes on there where the two main characters did this thing called Self-Care Sunday. That was amazing. Great idea. They would go out hiking. They were yoga. And so they would do things to take care of themselves. And I was just wondering, I wish that could be a product that we can adopt, within the Black community. And then I'm thinking about Black men and just the whole idea of self-care. So what does self-care look like for Black men? And is that something that we actually...
I definitely think it's something we do. We go get our hair cut. We'll go right to that barbershop. For those that still have hair or that go out and get it cut, we'll go to that barbershop, we'll sit there, we'll chat it up, and we'll get our hair cut. And that is a form of self-care. And I think for a lot of us, we know, particularly in the Black community, that the barbershop is an influential place on meeting brothers and getting the word out and getting there and chopping it up. And I know many therapists that will enter into that space and make it so. I think there's other places that we do self-care within, like spirituality, Black church, and other spaces, and going out to sporting events. And so it sounds like, is that all self-care? But we have to think about, what does self-care look like for that person, or for that identity. And so my thing is, those are the broader things. And so what I would say is, if we're looking at trying to start somewhere, particularly therapists that are trying to be advocates or trying to show up in spaces or send messages, maybe start where you're already seeing like this is happening as a form of self-care. Like, people are enjoying themselves when they go out to these events. Maybe we can show up in these places and start talking. But when we think about when it brings back down to the self, Sherman James, an epidemiologist, did some really good research and studying about hypertension and looking at Black people and Black men. And so what I really want Black men to really start thinking about is how to deal with the breathing and the muscles and not overworking themselves, because we get that message, you got to work 10 times harder. You have to be this person. And that message, when you talk about life expectancy for Black men, it's the lowest. And so we really have to think about how we eat differently, how we treat ourselves differently, and how we get that self-care. And so, I'll pass it on to Dr. A possibly, but at the same time, I think that's
Dr. A, what is mental health self-care? What should it look like for Black men? I
think that what people call self-care for any Black person should start with community care.
Okay.
I think that one of the cause of our imbalance is we fall into the patterns of vulgar individualism, right? So self-care gets defined as go off and just do something for you, right? In this kind of selfish attitude, just do it for you. Don't worry about anybody else. Just do what you need, right? That is the epitome of vulgar individualism. Whereas our culture, I believe at its heart, is communitarianism, is community care. And so I like what Dr. Span talked about, right? When you go to the barbershop, what are you doing? You're trying to get into a community. Right?
Connections.
It's the conversation that's healing, right? Not just the haircut. The haircut might be messed up, but that argument, right, that you had with those other brothers that was helpful, right? So self-care should look like connection building. I think that again, one of the aspects of toxic masculinity is rugged individualism. No. We need to be building connections with brothers. You talk about that young man trying to hug his father. We need to be able to hug some other brothers, right? Yep. When it's medically safe, right? At least give them a salute, right?
Yes.
But we need to be able to, whether it's go fishing, going bowling, whatever it is, right? Being in relationship with other men, right? Where we're caring for ourselves, exercising together, whatever it is. Ultimately, I think that, again, I push and struggle for us to move from this idea of the vulgar individualism of so-called self-care to thinking in terms of community care. For instance, when we wear a mask, it's not just to take care of us, it's to do what? Take care of our community, right? To think of making yourself strong as an important step to making our community strong.
Absolutely. All those ideas about connections, getting out there, not being isolated, and putting a priority on you. So Dr. Span, many of our listeners out there, they are clinicians, and they're wondering what can they do to support Black men and these for self-care, or possibly even introduce the concept to some of those clients. What can clinicians do specifically to help out Black men in self-health?
Yeah, sure. And for the clinicians that are here and then that be listening beyond, I encourage you to look into the work of Dr. Dave Vines, who talks about the broaching model, which get issues, social cultural issues, and how to engage and broach that with your clients. So particularly if you're looking for a theoretical model and research that really hits into getting into a multidimensional way of dealing with that, is Dr. Dave Vines, and she deals with broaching, and she talks about race, ethnicity, and culture, and how to broach and come up with that. So once you're able to understand the differences as a counselor, the individual difference for that individual, and then talk about the social political issues, you're then able to get in the whole identity of the person, and then talk about what are some techniques, what are self-care, what is empowerment, what is advocacy, what is social justice. And in that, thinking about mental wellness is a way of social justice, a form of that. And so thinking about how eating, drinking, exercise, thinking about mental wellness, and thinking about how to reduce the anxiety and reduce the stress that comes along with the social political issues. And ways of doing that, as we talked about, collectivism and through activities and through community. What I do with a lot of my brothers, I talk about social justice and empowerment. That in itself is a way of self-care, and they find that they're navigating through these issues a lot better. But I think anytime you eat fresh foods, exercise, find collective ways of connecting to people, it helps with the self-care.
Absolutely. Dr. A, what can you tell us about what type of tips or insight can you provide to the clinicians who are listening and they're trying to help out their Black male clients?
I think the therapeutic community that I associate with most is narrative therapy. And there's an idea with it called taking a not knowing stance. I think that becomes important to assume that you don't know. And when you don't know, what do? You ask curious questions. I think that the greatest skill that any therapist can have is, and it's a skill to be able to ask questions, right? Because you want to be able to ask questions in ways that are inviting people. So, so one of the most important things I think that any clinician can do is, first of all, learn to take a not knowing stance. And secondly, to really build your question asking skill, to ask curious, inviting questions about your client, and to really learn from them. Let them teach you first. So first start in that teaching mode, being taught mode, so that you and your client together can begin to collaborate to really understand what it is they are wanting for themselves.
Gotcha. What I can encourage many of the therapists out there who are watching, allow simply, it sounds easy, but allow your client to be them. Invite them to allow their core self to be seen, to get in contact with that, connect with that core self. But the question is, how are you going to respond to it? Many of my Black clients who come in, particularly the males, the men, they come in because they had another therapist and they didn't feel like the therapist connected with them, or they had to explain a lot of things and they couldn't be their real self, from where they come from and how they communicate, with other individuals. And I just found that to be a challenge sometimes with some other therapists, and allowing your client to present to you who they are without any judgment. But it sounds simple, but what are some of those barriers out there for some of these clinicians, Dr. Spann, to connect with their Black male clients?
I think the barriers, and again, it goes back to some of what Dr. Devines has done with her work, is that not knowing how. And, there's a point where it's okay to acknowledge that I don't know how really to do this. But after a while, it's like what Dr. A is saying, that being in a place of not knowing, but then also after receiving information, talking about the differences, and then broaching and creating statements or questions, and collectively working with your client. And so I always work in solidarity. I say we're working in a collective approach in the therapeutic alliance. We're talking about open subjects. You're using your narrative, but I need to get to know you. And so I like where Dr. A went with that, and also learning and go beyond some of the things that you're not sure about, and coming up with questions that get into the narrative of that individual and the social political issues, and then to the identified problem.
Gotcha. But thank you so much. And guys, we're near the end of today's webinar. I've learned a great deal today, and I really appreciate all the information that you provided. I just want to give you guys just a last opportunity to say whatever about Black men and mental health. And we can start with you, Dr. A.
I think it's definitely an important subject. I believe in community care, which means that particularly if we are clinicians, if we're therapists, one of the important things that we can teach our own community is to be compassionate and look out for brothers and sisters who might need some support, right? To be able to teach mental health first aid, and to create the kind of practices and environments where people know that we're there and are looking for us, to let them know that we have taken an option on the side of the Black community, so that the Black community there will come and look for us. That will decrease a lot of what people call stigma. When people feel that your space is a safe space, that your space is a space that feels like the barbershop or the beauty shop, right? They're gonna start looking for you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Spann, what are your final thoughts or something you just want to say?
Yeah, we need more accomplices. Dr. David Ford put that word into my head now, and I use it now, accomplice. I need for you to be in spaces where maybe I'm not at, and you're speaking up, advocating. We need people to talk about this across the board. It's not just Black people talking about Black people, or people of color talking about working with people of color. Everybody needs to be in a place of accomplice where we're saying that I'm going to step up in places where I heard this conversation, I heard that microaggression, or we're talking about this in places of ACA, APA. We're talking this at the institutional level, but we need accomplices where we're working, where I know maybe you're not in that space or we're in the same space, and we're pushing it out, and we're all working on one accord.
Absolutely. And what I can finally say is, despite the tragic situations that have put us in our current circumstances, I am excited about the energy that I see, particularly within the Black community, when talking about mental and emotional health, mental wellness. I'm hearing people talk about it for the first time. I'm seeing many more social media posts about mental health within the Black churches are talking about it. Hallelujah. Finally, how to take care of your mental health. And I'm also excited that a number of therapists are out there wanting to learn more. How can I be more effective? How can I be more culturally competent? And so I'm really hopeful that we have provided you guys with a lot of information, a lot of insight, and some tools to help you to be effective with your clients that are out there. Today's webinar, and I just want to give the two panelists an opportunity to tell the guests, how can someone reach you and contact you? Dr. Span, let's start with you. How can the audience reach you?
Well, social handles really quick is really Span for most things, so just that's one way. And then for my website, it's www.unmindllc.com. So it's UINMINDLLC.com.
And people reach you?
Yeah, it's at Dr. Makungu, Makungu, DrMakungu. And my web address is the same, drmakungu.com, drmakungu.com.
Gotcha. You guys can reach me as well, but the best place is to go to my website. It is www.harrisondavis.com, and you guys can find my contact information there and all of my social media handles. So thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, Dr. Akinyela, and Dr. Span on such an enlightening and informational conversation around Black men and mental health. A recording will be sent out to all registrants today. Please feel free to share. A link to the evaluation survey will only be listed in the show. Be sure to check that out in the chat box. Only those that attended the full panel will receive it. Be sure to click on the link and complete the survey at your earliest convenience. Last, if you have not already registered, all are welcome to attend next week's panel on multicultural counseling and allyship. A link to register will be provided in the chat box as well. On behalf of the American Counseling Association and Motivo, thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day and be safe.